The wind carried dust like a living thing, curling around wagon wheels and wooden posts, whispering against every surface of the small frontier town. The sun had bleached the earth until it looked bone-dry, cracked as old hands. Even the dogs were quiet in that heat. Folks leaned in doorways, hats tilted low, waiting for something to happen, though nothing ever really did, except the next stage rolling in with its cargo of strangers and bad luck. When the freight wagon came that afternoon, the townsfolk stirred. A girl stepped down from the back, her shawl drawn close as though the cloth alone could keep her safe. She was young, 19 maybe, with travel dust on her skirt and tired eyes that hadn't slept proper in days. Her name was Mara Kincaid, though no one there cared enough to ask. Her parents had died crossing the plains, their wagon overturned in a flood. Mara had buried them with her own hands, prayed without words, and kept walking west because it was the only direction left. By the time she reached the town of Redemption Creek, she had nothing left but her name, a torn satchel, and a hunger that lived deeper than her stomach. The saloon keeper, Harlan Voss, met her first, a man with a red face and a gold tooth that flashed when he grinned. He asked if she had anyone waiting for her, any kin or claim. She said no, her voice flat as the plane. That was all he needed to hear. Well now, he said, tugging at his vest. We got men here need wives, and you need a place to sleep. That's fair trade, I reckon. She didn't answer. She'd seen men like him before, the kind who called cruelty a favor, who thought women were currency to be traded under lamplight. By nightfall, word had spread. The saloon filled early, ranch hands, drifters, and miners drawn by the promise of cheap whiskey and cruel amusement. The piano clanked out a sour tune, and the air smelled of tobacco and sweat. Mara stood near the back, stiff as a post, her shawl pulled tighter. She didn't cry. Not when the men laughed, not when Harlan clapped his hands and shouted over the noise. Gentlemen, seems the Lord sent us a gift. A fine, pure young woman, a real lady. Needs a husband, and I aim to see her settled. Bidding starts at $10. The laughter rose like thunder. Coins clinked. Men jostled, smirking as they shouted out numbers. 10 became 20, then 30. Harlan's grin widened with every shout. Mara's gaze drifted to the door, half expecting the earth to open up and swallow her. She thought of running, but there was nowhere to go. Only the dark and the open land. And then, over the noise, came a voice. Low, steady, enough. It wasn't shouted, yet the room fell quiet all the same. A man stood near the entrance, tall, lean, weathered by sun and years. His coat was dusty, his boots worn. A rifle hung across his back, and in the crook of his arm slept a small girl, her face buried against his shoulder. He walked forward with the kind of stillness that made space around him. When he reached the bar, he set the girl on a stool and placed a folded stack of bills on the counter. That's for her, he said, nodding toward Mara. And that's the last word of it. Harlan blinked. Now hold on, Eli Turner. You can't just... I can. There was something final in his tone, the weight of a man who'd already seen more loss than argument. The room held its breath. No one moved. Mara's heart hammered in her chest. She didn't know whether to be grateful or afraid. Eli lifted the sleeping child again and turned toward her. His eyes were the color of rain-wet earth, unreadable. You comin'? For a moment she couldn't speak, but the silence of the room pressed against her like a wall, and so she moved, one step, then another, until she stood beside him. No one stopped her. No one dared. They stepped out into the night. The air was cold, the stars distant and sharp. Behind them, laughter crept back into the saloon like rot returning to wood. Eli led her to a buckboard wagon tied out front. He helped her climb in without a word, then laid the little girl, Lydia, he later said, beneath a wool blanket. The horses stirred, their breath misting pale in the lantern light. They rode in silence. The town fell away behind them, swallowed by the dark. The road wound through barren hills, the moonlight silvering the stones. Mara watched the land pass, her fingers twisting the fringe of her shawl. She wanted to ask why he'd done it, why he'd spent what looked like all he had. But something in his face warned her against words. After a long while he spoke. Name's Turner. Ranch is about 6 miles out, she nodded. Mara. He gave no reply. The wind picked up, carrying the faint scent of sage and old smoke. A coyote cried somewhere in the distance, a thin, lonely sound. She thought of her mother's hands, of the hymn she used to hum when nights grew long. The melody slipped through her memory like a ghost, gone before she could hold it. When they reached the ranch, dawn was breaking. The house stood plain and sturdy, its roof bowed under the years. A single lantern burned in the window, its light soft as breath. Fences stretched into the mist, and a windmill turned slow against the sky. Eli stopped the wagon and helped her down. "You can take the small room by the kitchen," he said, voice even. "There's work if you want it. Food if you can cook. Ain't much else to offer." Mara nodded again, her voice caught in her throat. He carried Lydia inside without another glance. Left alone, she looked out over the land, wide, empty, endless. It was both a promise and a warning. The kind of place that kept secrets, that buried the past beneath its silence. She stood there a long while, until the sun rose enough to warm her face. Then she followed the sound of the door creaking open and stepped inside. The house smelled of wood smoke, old leather, and something faintly sweet. Coffee, maybe. It felt strange being in a place that didn't yet belong to her, but didn't push her away either. And for the first time in months, Mara Kincaid felt the smallest thread of something she hadn't dared to name. Not hope, exactly, but the trembling edge of it. Morning came gray and thin, the kind that seemed half asleep. The Turner ranch woke not to roosters but to silence, the creak of old boards, the sigh of wind through unpatched eaves. Out beyond the window, the prairie stretched wide and unbroken, a sheet of frost and golden grass running to the ends of sight. Mara rose early, as she had every morning since she arrived. The small room by the kitchen smelled faintly of ash and wool. Its single window looked toward the barn, where Eli's shadow moved slow and steady among the horses. He had left her a list of chores on the table, simple things, written in a hand both rough and careful. She boiled coffee, swept the floor, fed the chickens. The rhythm of the work gave her something she hadn't realized she missed, the quiet order of a place that expected her to stay. Yet she kept her distance. Gratitude was dangerous. It softened the edges she'd built for protection. Lydia followed her like a small echo. The child was no more than 5, wild-haired, bright-eyed, half sunbeam and half storm. She asked questions without fear, and most of them about Mara. "Were you a princess once?" she asked one afternoon, as Mara mended a torn shirt by the porch. Mara smiled faintly. "No, just a girl who didn't belong anywhere." Lydia thought on that. Papa says sometimes not belonging is a kind of freedom. Mara glanced toward the corral, where Eli worked mending a broken fence post. His movements were steady, patient, each strike of the hammer echoing across the yard. She wondered if freedom ever felt as lonely as that. The house still carried the scent and shadow of another woman. The late Anna Turner lingered in small, careful touches. A folded quilt on the sofa, a hair ribbon tucked between Bible pages, a wooden cradle stored in the attic. In the parlor, a rocking chair faced the window, worn smooth from years of use. A faded bonnet hung from its back, pale as memory. Sometimes, when the night grew long and the fire burned low, Mara swore she could hear it, the faint creak of that chair, moving by itself in the dark. Eli never spoke of his wife, but the silence around her name said enough. The town had told Mara what it knew. How raiders came one spring night while Eli was away. How Anna had stood her ground to protect the child. When he returned, there was only ash and smoke and a crying infant by the door. The memory of that fire had hollowed something in him. He carried it still. In his eyes, in the way he paused before speaking, as if measuring the worth of every word. When he looked at Mara, there was no hunger there, only caution. A man who feared he might wound what he touched. For the first weeks they spoke little beyond necessity. She thanked him for meals. He nodded, that was all. But silence, when lived in long enough, begins to speak in its own way. One evening, while the wind clawed at the windows, Mara found him by the barn sharpening a blade. The light from his lantern fell soft across his face, catching the gray in his beard. "You could have left me there," she said quietly. He didn't look up. "Didn't seem right, that all." "That's enough." She studied him a long while. His hands were scarred. Old burns, old work. Not the hands of a cruel man, but one who'd done hard things. She wanted to ask why he'd stayed alone so long, why he'd chosen silence over company. But she knew better than to pry into a man's grief. Some things, like winter soil, only open when they're ready. Later that night, she lay awake listening to the wind whistle through the chimney. In her dreams, she saw her father again, tall, stern, the lines of his face cut deep by disappointment. He used to tell her that the world was a bargain, that every kindness had a price. "Never trust a man who gives without asking," he'd said. "He's only waiting to collect in ways you won't like." But Eli Turner hadn't asked for anything. Not her hand, not her bed, not her gratitude. He treated her presence as if it were weather, something that simply existed. It unsettled her more than cruelty ever had. The next morning, she found a pot of coffee warming on the stove and a note in Eli's rough scrawl. Took Lydia to the north pasture.
"Fix the gate."
Feeds in the bin, no signature, no courtesy, just fact. Yet something in it, the matter-of-fact thoughtfulness, felt like a small thread stretched across the cold distance between them. By the week's end, the neighbors began to whisper. Old Mrs. Calloway, who ran the mercantile, looked Mara over with a pitying smirk. "Heard he bought you off Harlan Voss. Strange way to find a home." Mara said nothing. She only met the woman's eyes until the smile faltered. In town, she felt the weight of every stare. To them, she was no wife, no widow, no hired girl, just a woman with no story she could afford to tell. That evening, as they rode home with Lydia between them, Mara asked softly, "Doesn't it bother you?" "What they say?" Eli flicked the reins, eyes on the fading road. "Town talks no matter who you are. Best thing's not to listen. And if they're right?" He glanced at her then, a shadow of something like pain crossing his face. "You think I bought you?" She hesitated. "I don't know what to think." He exhaled slowly, the sound almost a sigh. "Then think this. I just couldn't watch it happen." They rode the rest of the way in silence. That night, when the moon rose pale over the ridge, Mara stepped onto the porch. The wind carried a low hum through the fields, like the land itself was remembering. Behind her, through the window, Eli sat at the table carving a small wooden horse for Lydia. The firelight touched his face, softened his edges. For the first time, she saw not a rescuer or a stranger, but a man simply trying to live with what was left of him. She wrapped her shawl tighter and looked out at the wide prairie. Feeling the cold settle deep, maybe mercy and guilt wore the same face after all. Winter came not with snow at first, but with silence, the kind that crept across the land like a warning. The air grew sharp enough to bite, and the prairie grass bent low beneath the weight of unseen frost. Mara wrapped Lydia in blankets each morning before tending to the fire, her breath ghosting white in the chill. The days shortened, and the nights began to stretch, long, restless things filled with wind, and the restless moan of the barn siding. Eli worked through it as if the cold were nothing new. He patched fences, checked on the horses, and split enough wood to last the season. His hands were cracked from the cold, his breath steady clouds that vanished into the gray. Mara watched him from the window sometimes, feeling the strange comfort of his presence moving across the yard. Steady, dependable, silent. Then one evening, just as the last light drained from the sky, a rider appeared. The figure came out of the dusk like a ghost, slumped in the saddle, coat torn, horse stumbling. Eli was on the porch before Mara could speak, rifle in hand. The man slid from his mount and hit the ground hard, groaning. Blood showed dark against the snow. "Please," the stranger rasped. I was jumped on the trail. "Need shelter?" Just till morning, Eli hesitated, eyes narrowing. "Who did this?" "Two men. Took my horse gear, near froze me to death." The words came weak but quick, practiced somehow. Still, Eli lifted him under the arms and helped him inside. Mara fetched a blanket, though something inside her turned cold the moment the man's face met the light. She knew that face. The crooked nose, the scar through one eyebrow. Unmistakable. Rusk. He'd been there the night at the saloon, one of Harlan Voss's men, the one who laughed loudest when the bidding started. She froze, the basin of water trembling in her hands. Rusk caught her staring and grinned, though the pain in his side made it twist cruelly. "Well now," he said, voice low, "ain't this a surprise?" Eli's gaze shifted between them. "You know him." Mara's throat tightened. He worked for Voss, the one who... Eli's jaw hardened. He didn't need her to finish. Rusk raised both hands, palms outward. "Easy now, mister. I ain't here to cause trouble. Just cold and hurt. Let me rest, and I'll be gone at first light." Outside, the wind began to rise, a long, hollow cry through the fields. Snow started to fall, faint at first, then thick as ash from a dying fire. Eli said nothing. He took the stranger's revolver, checked it, and set it on the mantel where everyone could see. "You'll sleep by the fire," he said flatly. "You move wrong. I'll put you back in the snow where I found you." Rusk gave a mock salute, wincing as he sank to the floor. Fair enough, the storm came fast. By nightfall, it beat against the shutters like fists. The roof moaned. Wind pushed smoke down the chimney, filling the room with a faint sting. Mara kept Lydia close in her lap, humming to keep the child calm. Rusk watched her from the hearth, his eyes too familiar, sly, knowing. Every time she looked up, he was already looking. Eli tended the fire, his back to the man but his shoulders tense. The rifle leaned within arm's reach, the hours crawled. The storm roared louder, swallowing the world outside. When Lydia finally fell asleep in Mara's arms, Eli nodded toward the back room. "Take her. Get her settled." Mara carried the girl to bed and lingered by the doorway. She could hear the low murmur of men's voices, Rusk talking too much, Eli answering too little. "Heard Voss still wants her back," Rusk was saying, his tone like a blade under cloth. "Says she owes him. Calls her his runaway bride. You really think you can keep what don't belong to you?" Eli's answer came quiet but sharp. "She belongs to no one." A pause. Then a chuckle that didn't sound like laughter. "That right? A man don't spend that kind of money unless he wants something." The scrape of a chair followed. Then silence. Mara's heart beat fast. She couldn't tell if she was more afraid for Eli or of what he might do. She crept closer, the boards cold beneath her bare feet. Through the doorway's crack, she saw Rusk leaning forward, grinning, his hand inching toward the mantel, toward the gun Eli had set there earlier. Eli moved faster than sight. The next sound was the click of steel against skin. His rifle barrel pressed against Rusk's throat, steady as stone. "I told you one move wrong," Eli said. "That was your one." Rusk froze, hands raised. "You gonna shoot me for talking?" "No," Eli said. "For looking?" The wind howled. Snow blew in under the door, scattering white across the floorboards. Mara stepped into view without meaning to. Her voice came small, shaking. "Eli, don't!" He didn't look back at her. His eyes were locked on Rusk's. "Get up," he said. "You can walk, can't you?" Rusk spat in the dirt but obeyed, rising slow. "Storm'll kill me out there." Eli's voice stayed cold. "Better the storm than what's in here." He opened the door. The wind rushed in, wild and freezing. Rusk stumbled into the dark, cursing. For a moment, he was a shape against the snow, then gone, swallowed whole by the storm. Eli stood there a while, staring into the white blur. Snow gathered on his shoulders before he shut the door and leaned the rifle against the wall. Mara trembled. "You could have killed him." He nodded once. "Would have if Lydia wasn't here." They said nothing more. The fire crackled low. The storm battered the windows like an angry ghost. Later, when the house was still, Mara found him sitting by the dying embers, elbows on his knees. His face was unreadable, not proud, not sorry, just tired. She stood in the doorway, shawl around her shoulders. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked up. "For what?" "For seeing me." Eli's eyes softened a fraction. Ain't a hard thing to do, but she knew it was. Outside, the wind began to calm. Dawn would bring tracks in the snow and maybe blood along them. But for now, the world was quiet again, and for the first time since leaving the town behind, Mara felt something close to safety, not because a man had claimed her, but because one had chosen to protect her without asking for anything in return. The snow did not stop for days. It fell thick and soft across the Turner ranch, burying the fences, muting the sound of the world. Inside, the air was heavy with smoke and quiet labor. Eli sat near the fire, his shoulder bound in rough linen, jaw tight with pain. He refused the bed, saying the cattle needed tending even if the world froze over. Mara knew better. The wound burned beneath the bandages, the fever rising behind his silence. By lamplight she cleaned it again, her hands steady though her heart was not. The scent of whiskey and pine filled the room. Shadows swayed across the wooden walls. Outside, the wind sang through the chinks, and the rocking chair by the window creaked, as though the ghost of Eli's late wife still sat there. Mara's fingers brushed his scarred skin only long enough to tie the bandage. Neither spoke. It was not modesty that held their tongues, but something heavier, the strange, sacred distance between two people who owed each other too much. Lydia lingered on the stairs, wrapped in her small blanket. Her eyes flickered between them, curious and quiet. She did not remember her mother's face, only her absence. When Mara caught her watching, she smiled faintly and said, "Back to bed now." "Little one," but Lydia only whispered, "You don't sound afraid anymore," before she disappeared into the dark. Later that week, the storm eased. Mara shoveled paths through the snow, mended Eli's torn coat, and tended to the animals while he limped after her, offering gruff thanks that carried more feeling than words ever could. But when she rode to town for salt and flour, the air turned colder still. Whispers followed her through the mercantile, that the saloon keeper had put a bounty on her name. "Said she'd run off owing him money," said Eli Turner had bought himself another woman. That night, she told him everything. Eli listened in stillness, his eyes unreadable. When she said she would leave to spare him trouble, he stood from his chair and said, quiet but firm, "No one's taking you again." The sentence hung in the air, not an order, not a claim, but a promise made in the plain language of a man who'd already lost too much. When the lamps were blown out, Mara sat by the fire alone, mending Lydia's torn shawl. The needle trembled in her fingers, the thread glinting gold in the ember light. With each stitch, she felt something binding back together. Not the fabric, not even the child's small comfort, but the fragile trust taking root in her chest. The storm outside was ending. Inside, another kind, softer, quieter, was just beginning. Emotional tone and realization, tense, tender, and introspective. Beneath the silence, a fragile tenderness grows. Not the wild heat of romance, but the quiet ache of two lonely souls learning how to belong. The shawl becomes a symbol of repair, of something torn and carefully mended, just like them. The dawn came pale and cruel, seeping through the frost-laced windows. Mara was already awake, stoking the fire when the sound of hooves broke the silence. 3 riders cut through the snow, their figures dark against the dim horizon. Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle in hand, coat collar turned up against the cold. Behind him the door creaked open and Mara appeared, clutching Lydia's shawl around her shoulders. The child still slept upstairs, unaware of the storm gathering outside. The saloon keeper rode at the front, his hat dusted white, his eyes hard with self-righteous greed. "Morning, Turner," he called, his voice sharp in the brittle air. "Reckon you've got something of mine." "The girl owes a debt, and debts get paid one way or another." Eli didn't move. "She doesn't owe you a damn thing." The 2 men flanking the saloon keeper shifted in their saddles, rifles across their laps. The smell of horse and gun oil drifted on the wind. Mara stood beside Eli, not behind. Her pulse hammered in her throat, but her voice stayed steady. "You've no right to me," she said, the words tasting like freedom. The saloon keeper sneered. "You forget where you came from, girl? Folks don't change their kind. Now step aside, Turner. She walks, or you both die." Eli didn't flinch. "You ride back to town, or you don't ride at all." The man's hand twitched. One of his hired guns spat tobacco into the snow. Then the crack split the morning, a single shot, sharp as lightning. The porch rail exploded beside Eli's arm. He fired back before the echo faded. 1 man fell. The others turned, their horses rearing and snorting in terror. The saloon keeper clutched his arm, cursing, and galloped into the trees, leaving the dead behind. When the smoke cleared, the silence returned, thick, heavy, and endless. Snowflakes drifted through the air, landing on the blood-streaked boards of the porch. Eli staggered, the rifle slipping from his grasp. Mara caught him before he fell, her hands pressing against the wound in his arm. The heat of his blood shocked her through the cold. Inside, she laid him by the fire, tore linen for bandages, and worked without trembling. He watched her through half-lidded eyes, breath shallow. "You should have stayed inside," he muttered. She shook her head. "I won't hide again." The words silenced him. Only the fire spoke, its low crackle echoing through the room. Shadows danced along the walls, flickering across the rocking chair, the bonnet, the wedding dress that still hung untouched in the corner. Mara pressed a cloth to his arm, tears falling unnoticed onto his sleeve. Eli's voice came rough and quiet. "You were never mine to keep, but I'd die before I let him take you." She looked at him, the firelight reflecting in her eyes like twin embers. Then she did the one thing she hadn't done since she'd arrived. She reached for him. Her hand found his, trembling, small against his rough palm. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. The silence between them said enough about what had been lost, what had been found, and what neither dared name. Outside, the snow kept falling, softening the blood, covering the trail of the men who'd come to take her. Inside, the fire burned low, not wild, not consuming, but steady. A quiet warmth born of pain and defiance. When Lydia woke and came down the stairs, she found Mara asleep beside the hearth, Eli's hand still clasped in hers. The child climbed between them and laid her head on Mara's knee. For the first time, the house did not feel haunted. It felt like something new, fragile, flickering, but alive. Emotional tone and realization, raw and redemptive. Violence gives way to truth. The fire symbolizes both destruction and warmth, a reckoning that turns fear into understanding. In the end, love doesn't need to be spoken. It breathes quietly between them, like the last glow of embers refusing to die. Weeks passed before the lawmen came. Their horses rode slow through the town, dust rising in the first warmth of spring. They questioned, they nodded, they left. The verdict spread quiet as dawn. Eli Turner had acted in self-defense. One man dead, another wounded, but no crime to answer for. Justice, such as it was, came without ceremony. Yet justice never silenced whispers. In the mercantile, women lowered their eyes when Mara entered. At the well, someone muttered, "Bought girl," and another spat into the dirt. She felt their words like pebbles in her shoe, small, sharp, and constant. But she no longer bent beneath them. Each day she carried water, fed the stock, sewed new curtains for the house that had once belonged to another woman. Her hands no longer shook. Sunday came clear and cold, the kind of morning that made the sky seem endless. Eli dressed Lydia in her best calico dress and brushed the child's hair with slow, careful strokes. Mara came down the stairs in silence, wearing the white dress she'd sewn from scraps of old fabric, plain but clean, stitched with her own steadiness. The room went still. Eli looked at her for a long moment and then said softly, "You'll want a shawl." It's still cool out. At church, the pews creaked beneath the weight of stairs. The preacher spoke of forgiveness and labor, of good men and God's mercy. Mara listened without looking down. Lydia sat between them, swinging her feet, humming under her breath. When the sermon ended, no one spoke to them, but neither did anyone dare whisper aloud. She had learned that silence, too, could be its own kind of respect. The thaw came soon after. Snow melted into rivulets that cut through the pasture. Calves bawled in the fields. Smoke rose steady from the chimney, curling like a promise into the clear sky. One morning, Mara stood by the corral, her hand resting on the mare's mane. The restlessness had returned, not the fear of flight, but the yearning to move, to see what waited beyond the line of hills. She packed light, a loaf of bread, a small knife, Lydia's old shawl folded carefully, and a scrap of the white dress she'd sewn, a token, not of what she left behind, but what she'd reclaimed. Eli came out carrying the saddle, his limp faint but steady. They worked in silence as they always had. When the cinch was tied, he stood beside her, watching the sun rise over the plain. "You sure about this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "I came here because I had nowhere else to go. Now I do." He looked at her then, really looked, as though memorizing her face the way a man memorizes a horizon he'll never touch again. "You'll always have a home here," he said, voice rough but certain. She smiled faintly. "I know." Lydia ran out from the porch, waving both hands, her hair flying wild. "Don't forget us," she shouted. Mara crouched to hug her, breathing in the smell of wood smoke and soap, the warmth of a child's small arms. "I couldn't if I tried," she whispered. Then she mounted the mare and turned toward the open plain. The wind caught her hair, lifted her shawl like a banner. Eli watched until she was only a small figure against the light, riding through the wet shimmer of spring. The air smelled of thawed earth and grass, a scent that spoke of things beginning again. Mara did not look back after the ridge. She rode until the land opened wide, until the horizon blurred into sky. The wind dried her tears before they could fall. She was no longer for sale, no longer owned, no longer anyone's secret or shame. The road ahead was uncertain, but it was hers, earned through mercy, courage, and the quiet love that had asked nothing in return. By the time dusk settled, she found herself beside a stream, the water running clear and cold. She dismounted, knelt, and washed her hands. The dust, the blood, the memories. The ripples carried them away. The white of her dress caught the last red light of the sun, glowing like a small fire against the vastness of the world. For the first time, she did not feel small. She felt whole, emotional tone and realization, bittersweet, hopeful, and deeply human. The story closes in quiet renewal, not with romance but with dignity and choice. Freedom and affection coexist without possession. The frontier remains endless, mirroring the expanse of a heart finally set free.